Thank you so much. I'm really pleased next to introduce Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. She's a political economist and professor of community justice and social economic development in the African Studies Department at John Jay College at City University of New York. She's also an affiliate scholar with the Center for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan. She has numerous publications on cooperative economics, community economic development, credit unions, wealth inequality, community wealth, and Black political economy. In her most recent book, Collective Courage, I've read it cover to cover, and it is also for sale in the front, and I'm sure Jessica would sign it for you. She chronicles African American cooperative business ownership and its place in the movements for the Black civil rights, and economic equality. She finds that African Americans, as well as other people of color and low-income people, have benefited greatly from cooperative ownership and democratic economic participation throughout the nation's history. She's an outstanding example of an activist scholar. She's a member of the Grassroots Economic Organizing newsletter, GEO, which I've read many times, and its collective, and as well as the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, the Eastern Conference for Workplace Democracy, the Southern Grassroots Economies Project, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, the Association of Cooperative Educators, and the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. Here in D.C., she's a member of the Shared Leadership Team for One D.C., the Organizing Neighborhood Equity. And finally, she's a proud grandmother of two. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Gordon-Nembhard.
Thanks. Is this on? Yes. Thanks so much. Good evening, everybody. The lights are really horrible, so I can't really keep looking up at you, which I'd rather do, so I apologize for that. So I'm here to kind of take us back again to look at the money challenges and the capital market challenges for people of color throughout the centuries here. To remind us of the other ways that we need and reasons why we need public banking. I actually forgot to tell you, Ruth, that you could also say that I started my economics career in international finance and monetary policy, even though I ended up doing community economic development instead. But so even though I haven't done a lot with banking, I have actually done some work on credit unions, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we did talk about that I should sort of give us a little bit of history of African Americans trying to look for alternative financing because they had so much trouble getting into capital markets, and the capital markets were so discriminatory. And I, too, actually wanted to start with a quote, though, of course, I forgot to bring it, but I can tell you the gist of it. 1907, W.E.B. Du Bois, who most of you know is a relatively accomplished African-American scholar and activist. In 1907, he actually had a conference on African-American, well, in those days, Negro businesses and Negro cooperative business development. And at the end of that conference, he made a statement that we stand at the crossroads. He said, we could and have been moving in a capitalist fashion for individuals of us to make it and to gain a little bit of wealth and move away from the group. And so a few of us making it and the rest of us kind of being left behind. Or we could take another route, which is the co-op economics route, where we would have broad ownership, collective ownership, and more of us could actually make it be prosperous and well and do well. And of course, he was fearful that we were taking the wrong road. And I think we probably did. But I think we're also at a crossroads, as Gar was saying. I think we're at another moment where we could take the right road. And so I'm hoping that the kind of work that we're all doing will lead us closer to being more comfortable taking the road of cooperative economics and collective action. So African Americans have tried a variety of ways to get around the problem of predatory lending and lack of financial transparency and actual economic oppression in the capital markets. And this would be from the very beginning. So early on, we had what some people call isusus and SACOs, ways that we pooled our own small resources, put them all together in a pot, and then each month or each period, one of us would be able to take that money out and do something with it, start a business, send a child to college. In the early years, we pooled our money to buy each other out of slavery. And so that notion that we needed to do something collective when nobody else could help us was important. When we wanted to buy land and the banks we knew were going to take our money and then foreclose on us and we would lose our property, right? We started to do credit exchanges and then eventually credit unions and other ways, again, to pool our money, share it, and leverage it, share it, and lend it to each other so that we could do things without being preyed upon. The other notion that starts to come up is actually something that gets articulated by a woman named Helena Wilson, who I know probably nobody knows, but she was for 30 years the president of the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So most of you know the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. She and A. Philip Randolph actually had a co-op project for the Brotherhood and the Ladies Auxiliary, who were mostly the housewives, but also the maids in the sleeping cars. They really believed that it wasn't good enough just to have good union jobs and some middle-class income. They really wanted to figure out how to keep control of that money circulating in the black community. And again, cooperatives, credit unions were the way they were working to do that. So they had projects where they had members studying about cooperatives, studying about finance, studying about how to create credit unions and co-op stores and things like that. So they ended up, they actually started credit unions. They started one in Montreal, because remember the railroad lines went all the way up to Canada, so it was an international union, actually. And they also connected with those credit unions was a whole financial literacy project to how to think about money, how to have transparency about money, and then how to make sure that the money that was earned through the union could then go into the credit unions to then be lended back to the community. So that sense of this a holistic notion, right? So one, you're escaping the predatoriness, but then you're also using finance as a tool to do other things and to keep prosperity in your community was really important. Another group that's not African American, but that uses that same model of a very strong collective banking system would be the Mondragon system in Spain, right? For the Basque, that whole huge worker co-op and now consumer co-op complex is all revolves around everybody putting their money into the credit union, and the credit union then doing all the co-op development, the providing the funding for all the other things. So this notion of a bank and a banking system that we can control and that we can use to do the things we need to do and not have money be exploiting and oppressing us is really important throughout this. I need to talk about two other things. Well, two things. I wanted to talk a little bit about the barriers for credit unions, but I also promised to talk a little bit more about the role of black women, so I'm trying to figure out which one flows which way. But I guess we were talking about credit unions, so let's finish that part, and I'll go back to the black women. So I actually, in addition to doing this research on African American co-ops, I also have been studying credit unions as community assets, because as I said, I've been interested also in this whole notion about how we control the capital markets, right, and how we use them to do the things we need to do in communities. One of the things that we found in the research with credit unions are that they do some of the things that my German colleague was telling you the public banks are doing there. And if you noticed, the other interesting what was that light gray one, were the cooperative banks in Germany. And they were also doing a lot of the interesting things that the public banks were doing. So when we looked at that, we found, especially in the US, we have what we call community development credit unions. And they actually have a mission to address the issues to serve low-income communities with financial services. But guess what's happening to the community development credit unions? Two things are happening. One is the regulators, the National Credit Union Administration, is actually forcing them to merge with larger credit unions because the model is that you're not sustainable if you're not large. But the purpose of a credit union is to be owned by its members, right? For the depositors to own it, decide what to do with it, and use it to keep money circulating in their communities, right? So you have this opposite thing happening, right? We have the mission of the community development credit union being totally thwarted by the regulators who are making them be big. But if they had better access to capital, to loans, to funds and things like that, like through a public bank, right, then they could be shoring up, because the biggest problem with the community developed credit unions is they don't have enough deposits, right? They don't have large enough deposits to keep things flowing. So again, you can see these connections we're trying to make here. The other thing about the credit unions is they've often not really reminded their members that they're co-ops, right? So probably a lot of us are credit union members, but even I have to admit I don't always vote for the board, and most of the time I don't even know who those board members are on my credit union, right? So trying to connect those credit unions back to their democratic roots and back to actual democratic practice is another thing we need to do. And so figuring out how to connect that again. I think a campaign about public banking and a campaign about the importance of control and power being in local communities and in communities would also help us shore up the credit unions as well as to put in place the public banks. So that's my plea there. So I finally, let me end with a couple more examples about black women in this movement. So I told you about Helena Wilson, who nobody really knows about. There are other women in the co-op and credit union, black co-op and credit union movements who some of you might know a little better. DC, I think you all know Nannie Helen Burroughs. You should. The M Street School, which was originally the National Training School for Women and Girls, I think it was first called, in Northeast. She's also the founder of the Ladies Auxiliary to the National Baptist Association and was their first Secretary General. But she also was a co-op person. She created a worker co-op, actually, among women, unemployed women during the Depression. She applied for funds from the New Deal administration in the Department of Commerce in those days. They had what were called self-help co-op department that had funds for creating self-help co-ops, which were supposed to put more money into the hands of groups of people to put themselves to work. They also bought a farm in Maryland and then sold the produce in DC, so they did that farm to city connections. And she actually was asked by a lot of the mainstream co-op, the DC branch of CLUSA, the Co-op League of USA. There's lots of letters in her papers asking her to actually speak at places and speak on behalf of the DC Co-op Association. So she was definitely known as a good speaker and known as a promoter. And she, one of the things in the reports about this particular co-op, Cooperative Industries of DC, was how important education was. They actually put, I think, half of their surplus back into education so that people could understand more and more about what a co-op was, how to run a co-op, how to do it democratically, et cetera. How's my time? Okay, great. So let me end by talking about the ways I think that black women have tried to keep, how should I put this? I found in my book that often black women, even when they weren't the leaders of a lot of these co-op movements and co-op businesses, they were the ones that kept things going. There's some examples like a co-op in Gary, Indiana in the late 30s that kept having sort of ebbs and flows. They would start something and it would go well, and one year their store was the largest black grocery store in the country. They also created a credit union, a gas station, but another year the sales were low and people were thinking about quitting. But all the accounts say that the Women's Guild is the thing that kept everything together. So the Women's Guild met continuously, kept pushing things, kept trying new things. You find the same thing with the Ladies Auxiliary to the Brotherhood. Even when some of the experiments aren't working, or they're trying this co-op in Chicago or this co-op in Oakland, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes they have to regroup and start over, but they still persist. They keep studying, they keep working together, they keep persisting. So I do think that it's important for us to think about who are those stalwarts, right, who keep things going, who keep us thinking about what we need to do, and then who make those connections, right? Because again, especially before the 60s, I guess, women were seen as the homemakers and the ones keeping everything together. And these radical women really saw themselves, that homemaker job, as being the economic steward for the family. And so making sure that they understood, right, what to do to keep their household moving, but also what that meant in their communities. And then they went and acted upon that kind of collective stewardship of finances in a way that often made the difference between your family starving or your community starving, or your community having some level of prosperity. And so I think I'll end on that note.
Cool.